what Tiffany's asked me to talk to you about today is the single most useful thing I used to teach the undergraduates that I supervised at the University of Toronto. And I know it's the most useful thing because every time I bump into them years later, they tell me this, right? Code comes and goes. If you want to be productive, working with other people, this is probably the single most important skill that you have to acquire. And it turns out you don't need to know a lot in order to do better than most people. So first thing I'm going to say is you do not have to invent any of this stuff yourself. There's lots and lots of resources out there. My favorite these days is askamanager.org. Lots of good questions, lots of good discussions. If you are wondering how to navigate the company that you've just been hired by, what to do when things go wrong, what's going to be expected of you, anything and everything, this is a good place to start. Okay. So rule number 1, does there actually need to be a meeting? The answer is almost always no, okay? Because technology has removed a lot of the reasons that we used to have meetings. If the meeting is there just to inform people, no. Right? Create a wiki page, create a Google Doc. That's searchable afterwards. That means that people didn't have to be in the room in the moment to get the news. Right? You might still want to have a meeting if you are expecting a lot of questions, but that really comes down to number 3 here, discussion. Second reason people have meetings is to consult, and most consultation is a sham. If you don't get a vote and a veto, you're not really being asked your opinion. Okay? So before you have the meeting, make it clear to people, do they get to say no to whatever is being proposed? Is it going to be by majority? We'll come back to that. But if that isn't it, it's really case number 1. We're telling you we're just trying to be a little passive aggressive and British about it. Discussion meetings, yes, absolutely. Small groups that need to brainstorm, that need to do project planning, that need to come to some sort of a decision. It works really well, but only in small groups. Without well-defined procedural rules, it's very hard for a group larger than about half a dozen people to have a productive discussion. If you've got 20 people in a room having a meeting, either 6 people are having a meeting with a bunch of spectators, or you have 3 meetings going on at once. Now, if you have larger groups, then you have to adopt and teach a set of rules. Robert's Rules of Order, for example, is how the parliamentary system works in most English-speaking countries. How do you make a motion? How do you second a motion? How do you tell what's been agreed? Who gets speaking order? There are rules to manage that for the same reason that there are rules to manage a software project that's got 1,000 developers and a 2 million line code base. But most meetings aren't at that scale, and they don't need that degree of formality. And finally, actual collaboration. Let's sit together and do some pair programming. Let's clean the house, things like that. That's not really a meeting. Rule number 2, no agenda, no meeting. If nobody cares enough to take 2 minutes to put together a point form list of what we're going to discuss, then why are we having this meeting? Right? You want to include timings. We expect to spend 10 minutes on this. We expect to spend 5 minutes on this, and so forth. The first time you do that, your timings will be wildly optimistic, just as your estimates for how long it takes to write a piece of software, finish an assignment are initially wildly optimistic. Right? My dad's rule was take your first estimate, divide by 2, and then move up to the next larger unit. If you think this is 1 minute, it's half an hour. Okay? But with practice, you'll get better at estimating. And those estimates will be more accurate when you've had more practice running the meetings as well. You want to prioritize. It's a very common mistake to say, let's get a few small things out of the way at the start to leave time for the bigger issue. Those smaller things always wind up taking more time. As a result, I have actually been in meetings where 45 minutes was spent arguing over coffee club and who gets to pay how much for coffee when we've got a bunch of tea drinkers. And 5 minutes was then devoted to a $6.5 million annual budget. Right? Don't let this happen. The most important thing comes first because it needs the most time. And try to plan to end a bit early. My wife, who's a project manager, once told me that the fundamental unit of time is the bladder. I said, I've never thought about it that way. And she said, you've never been pregnant. Okay. I'm 58 years old. I have back problems. If I have to sit for more than about an hour, I'm not paying attention because I'm in pain. I have to get up and stretch every hour at least. Be mindful of that. Be mindful that people might physically have to get to another location. They might need to check on the kids in between meetings because we're all at home. Plan for 50 minutes. Rule number 3. You've got to have clear rules for making decisions. Now, again, I'm talking about a decision-making meeting, not a free-form discussion brainstorming meeting. Those are a different beast. But if the purpose of the meeting is to decide who's going to do what, what's going to be due when, are we going to buy this or not, there have to be rules. And this comes back to one of the most important essays of the 20th century, The Tyranny of Structurelessness, written by Freeman in the early 70s. Every group has a power structure. The only question is whether it is visible and accountable or whether it's implicit and unaccountable. I've worked for far too many groups that were essentially an old boys network with a website. One of my recent previous employers, for example, didn't publish the org chart internally. You could not find out who reported directly to who, even inside the company, which meant that power really flowed according to who you knew. Did you know the right person to call up? Did they feel that they owed you a favor? Were you extroverted enough and confident enough to just message somebody you'd never met before and say, hey, can we please have a meeting? Right? Without explicit rules for decision-making, power goes to the people who are well-connected, extroverted, confident, not necessarily smarter or better informed. Right? If you need Robert's rules for something like an annual convention of faculty associations with 600 members, then go and learn Robert's rules, and there's lots of online resources to teach you those. For smaller groups, I highly recommend a set of rules called Martha's Rules. There's a link there, and I can share the link with Tiffany to share with all of you. Basically, anytime there's a proposal, somebody has to write it up as a one-pager. Here's what we're planning to do. Here are the alternatives. Here's the impact, so that people know what they're agreeing with or disagreeing with. Those proposals have to be made available to everybody at least 24 hours before the meeting. There's a tactic, which I've used, called sandbagging. You show up to the meeting and then we say, surprise, we're going to discuss this thing that 3 of us have been talking about for a week, and you've now got 15 seconds to look over a 5-page proposal. Okay. It's an underhanded trick, and I've used it ruthlessly in the past. Don't let people do this. Okay. Once the proposal's been put on the table, you do a quick sense vote. Everybody is yes, no, or I don't care. If everybody is yes or I don't care, the motion passes without further discussion. If anybody in the group objects, then you have a few minutes of discussion, and then you have a straight up or down vote. Yes or no, and it goes by majority. This works pretty well. In practice, what happens is that if there are more than 1 or 2 objections, the person moving the proposal will probably take it away, rework it, and bring it back. This isn't the only way to make decisions in a group of 4 or 8 people, but it's a very effective one. It lends itself well to online. And as with football versus soccer, it doesn't matter what the rules are. It matters that everybody's playing by the same rules. Right? This is a typical proposal, and I can share examples if people want. The 2-line summary at the top, so that if people are looking through a bunch, they know which ones they need to read. What's the background? What are we actually proposing? What resources is it going to require? For a student team like yours, 4 of you working on a end-of-term project, it's probably not budget. It's probably, this is 3 days of work. This is 10 days of work. This is all 4 of us for a month, right? That's your resource. That's your bottleneck. Some kind of an FAQ, what questions have come up and what answers were there. And at the foot, I always have a history of the document. Yes, you can get that out of version control if you're doing this in a GitHub repo, but in a Google Doc or something like that, it's much handier just to have a point form list at the bottom, date, initials, 1 sentence about what changed. Okay, rule number 4. Somebody is in charge of every meeting. This doesn't mean that one person's doing all of the talking any more than the conductor is playing all of the instruments. Somebody needs to be the traffic cop to say, it's your turn to speak, now it's yours, we'll take that question later. If you can get somebody from outside the group to do this, that's great. You usually can't in groups like yours. So just rotate the responsibility from one person to the next through the meeting. Their main responsibility is to call on specific people in order, to stop them after one point. If somebody says, well, I've got 5 things that I want to say, the answer is say the first, and then we'll go around everybody else, and then you can say your second, right? And crucially, keep a backlog. And I don't know if you can see, the video is not very good, but in a meeting that I was just running a couple of hours ago, people would put questions into the side chat in Zoom so that I could see what questions they had or what points they wanted to make. I would jot them down so that I could group them and say, all right, let's deal with everybody's question about the budget first, and then we will deal with all of the questions people had about the changes to the website, rather than switching back and forth between topics based on who asked the most recent question. One of the other things you'll find is it reduces the number of questions because people will see that somebody else is raising the point, so they don't need to make it as well. Rule 5, require politeness. And in a sense, all of the other rules are just a special case of this one. Treating people as if their time matters, making sure that they have an equal say in things rather than, who did you used to room with in college? All of that is just a form of politeness. I don't allow side technology during in-person meetings unless it's needed for assistive purposes or somebody's got a pressing family need, right? I don't know if you know the phrase politeness mode. Politeness mode is when the buzzer's off and the phone is face down on the table where people can see that you're not checking it in your lap, right? You'll get a lot of pushback on this. You'll get a lot of pushback on people who are so used to having the laptop open that they instinctively do that. If people have to put away their electronics during a meeting, I promise the meeting will be shorter, as well as more productive. Okay. Another rule is no interruptions. Nobody gets to cut anybody else off except the moderator. If I think Thomas is talking too long, then I, as the moderator, get to say, all right, I'm calling time, let's go to Tiffany. Nobody else gets to do that because, again, if you allow interruptions, if you allow trampling, the meeting will very quickly be dominated by a privileged few, right? The converse of this is that if nobody else is allowed to interrupt, then the moderator has a responsibility to ensure that there is no rambling. Somebody who starts with saying, well, this is kind of half formed and I'm still figuring this out, the answer is great. We'll take another couple of questions while you jot down a couple of things and figure out what it is. We're not here to listen to your neural network get trained. Right? And finally, you do have a code of conduct, right? Good, okay. One of the reasons to have a code of conduct is to make sure that people from diverse backgrounds have agreed on a set of rules. What is inbounds and outbounds depends on where you're from. The second reason is so that people who violate it can't pretend that they didn't know there were rules. And Tiffany, just give me a thumbs up. Am I allowed to swear? Just once?
Sure.
Okay. Do people know the phrase Schrodinger's asshole? That's somebody, Schrodinger's cat is either alive or dead. Right. Schrodinger's asshole is somebody who says something offensive, then looks at the reaction and then decides whether they were just joking or not. Okay? The purpose of a code of conduct is to hold people like that accountable. There are rules, you know what there are boundaries you're not allowed to cross. You knew them coming into the meeting, right? So you don't get to pretend, oops. Right? Rule number 6, record the minutes. Many people are not aware that Joseph Stalin was not, in fact, the president of the Soviet Union in the early years of his power. He was the general secretary of the Communist Party. He was the one who decided on the agenda and took the meeting minutes, which meant he had all the real power, because he is the one who is creating the record of what was agreed. You want somebody taking notes and then putting those notes up on the project website, into the GitHub doc, whatever it is that you're doing, so that people who weren't there will know what happened, so that people who were there agree on what happened. I'll come back to that one. And so that people can be held accountable later. If I promised I'd have something ready next week, we can check next week's meeting to see what it was that I promised. Point number 2 here, I have occasionally come out of meetings believing that we'd reached agreement, only to discover that we'd only used the same words. We hadn't actually agreed on what they meant. Writing it down gives people a chance to check and say, no, that's not what I meant. Usually it's an innocent misunderstanding. Occasionally it's not. Either way, having that record means that I can't pretend afterwards, oops, that's really not what I intended. Rule number 7, you got to learn some techniques for managing that guy. And yeah, it's usually a guy. NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in the States, has this wonderful little site that classifies the kinds of people who will disrupt meetings and gives you ways for dealing with them. Very helpful, supportive, cheerful ways that are quite firm. Please look at this site. Here are some techniques that I particularly like using. One of them is called 3 stickies. Okay, in an in-person meeting, at the start of the meeting, everybody gets 3 sticky notes. Put them on your laptop, put them on the table in front of you, wherever it is. Every time you speak, it costs you a sticky note. When you're out of sticky notes, you are not allowed to talk until everyone at the table has used at least one of their sticky notes. This ensures that nobody is speaking more than 3 times as often as the quietest person in the room, and it completely changes the dynamic of the meeting. I have been in meetings where grown men pull $20 bills out of the wallet trying to buy a sticky note, and across the table there's a woman, and yes, it's always a man and woman, who's got her 3 sticky notes and a grin. It's like, now you know what it feels like to be me. It turns out that people who are perhaps a bit more introverted need a little bit more time to think. Maybe their English isn't quite as strong. Maybe they don't feel as confident in the room. They get trampled. This ensures that they get a chance to talk. There is a group that I'm a member of, a non-programming group, where we've had a rule for several years, 1 message per person, per topic, per day. Because what we found was we'd wake up here in North America and there'd be 85 messages back and forth between 3 people in the United Kingdom. And we just go, okay, I can't catch up. You know, I feel overwhelmed by this. There would be a few people who were constantly on the channels, constantly responding to things with good intention, but it just didn't leave any space for anybody else to breathe. Once we instituted this rule, we've had far more contributions from everybody, because now you have to stop and think, do I want to burn my 1 per topic on this, or is there something else, or what do I really want to say? Another good technique is called interruption bingo. At the start of the meeting, just draw a little grid. Everybody's name goes on the columns, everybody's name goes on the rows. Every time Jacob interrupts Thomas, we put a check mark in the appropriate box. We just keep a tally of who's interrupting who most often. What you will find after about 20 minutes is that the same 2 or 3 people are doing all of the interrupting, and they're usually not interrupting each other. They are interrupting people that they think are less confident or have lower social status. Again, once you start tracking this, most people aren't even aware that they're doing it. They'll throttle back. And if somebody is constantly interrupting and they're shown the data and they keep doing it, well, you just learned something, didn't you? Managing this sort of stuff is part of the moderator's job. The participants in the meeting are probably too busy thinking about the budget, the changes to the code, the website, job applications, whatever it is, to have the headspace to also manage the meeting in the same way that it's quite difficult to be both a star musician and a band leader at the same time. You can do it, but it's a double cognitive load and it's hard. Right? And again, please do check out the NOAA site. Flip side of having a moderator is rule number 8. You should be an active participant in meetings, not a passive participant. Feel free to decline invitations on the condition that you agree in advance with everything that the meeting decides. If you don't show up to vote, then you are implicitly saying, I agree with what the people who did show up decided to do. Okay? Look over the agenda and any other materials, any proposals before the meeting. And it's been quite a few years since I kicked somebody out of a meeting I was running because they hadn't taken the time to familiarize themselves with the proposals beforehand. But it's like showing up for dinner at somebody's house and you don't even know their name. Right? It's rude. Right? You can read faster than other people can talk. Take advantage of that. Try to take your own notes during the meeting. I frequently will jot things down and then cross them off as other people have asked the questions or answered the questions that I had. Makes you look smarter. Try to use participants' names so that it's clear who you're addressing. It feels a little bit pedantic at first, but particularly on Zoom or in a large setting where you can't see who somebody's looking at, it really helps if you prefix your comments or your questions with some sort of an identifier. Pausing for a couple of seconds before speaking to organize your thoughts will make you look more intelligent, and feel free to put your hand down. If you've raised a question, for example, in the Zoom chat, if you've put in a marker to say, I want to ask about X, somebody else asks it, just cross it off. Right? Now, chat doesn't lend itself to this. It's hard to go back up and delete something. Google Docs are better for small groups, but a pain for large groups because you've got 15 cursors all colliding on top of each other. This would be a trivial problem for an undergrad in computer science to solve. Like, you can imagine the tool that we would need to run meetings a little bit better. The fact that we don't have it is a sign of how few well-run meetings most software developers have ever been in. Okay. A few rules about online meetings. First, hard and fast rule, no mixed mode meetings. If you have 4 people in the room and 2 remote, the 2 who are remote are at a tremendous disadvantage. Right? So don't do that. A previous employer of mine had a rule, if anybody has to be remote, everybody has to be remote. And at first it feels silly to have 3 people who are in the same building going and finding quiet corners for video call because one person can't be there. As soon as you are the one person, you will appreciate the courtesy. Don't record meetings without willing consent. Right? A lot of people feel pressured into saying yes to recordings. I won't ask for a show of hands, but in a gathering this size, it's practically a certainty that at least one person on this call has at some point been on the wrong end of online harassment or abuse. The thought of video of yourself escaping your control is pretty scary. If you require that, some people won't participate in your meetings. And just on principle, I am opposed to increasing surveillance in our homes. Review the meeting protocol at the start. If there's anybody who hasn't been in the meetings with you before, just say, these are our ground rules. There's the code of conduct. If you're meeting with the same group week by week, obviously unnecessary. I tend to take minutes in a shared Google Doc for groups of up to half a dozen. One person will do most of the typing. Other people will sweep in behind, correct typos, add links, things like that. You very quickly fall into that rhythm. I used to use Etherpad, but that software has become increasingly fragile. Some people swear by HackMD. Some people use, any of a dozen different wiki systems, as long as it's real-time editing. And finally, raising your hand in the chat. There's an old Unix convention, /hand, right? But /hand, another budget item, is much better. 2 or 3 words to say, this is what I've got a question about or a comment about, allows the moderator to batch things together, allows people to see what direction the conversation is going to go. It only takes a few seconds. It quickly becomes second nature. You'll be surprised at how big a difference it is. Finally, if I could send advice back to my younger self, this is the slide I would send. Right? Seek truth, not victory. Right. The purpose of the meeting is not social dominance displays. Right? You don't actually every single point that somebody else makes. You don't nitpick. Right? I've heard this referred to as peacocking. You know how peacocks will spread their tail feathers? You will see people in meetings who are doing the same thing. Look at how smart I am. It doesn't actually move the meeting forward or contribute to a better decision, but gosh, don't I know a lot about Lord of the Rings, right? Moderators should shut that down. And if the moderator's doing it, pick a better moderator. Please don't raise points you don't actually believe in just to have them discussed. The devil does not need more advocates, right? And on the flip side, please don't make excuses for your questions or opinions, right? People who identify as feminine are particularly prone to do this. This is probably stupid, but no, it probably isn't. And if it is, go ahead and ask anyway, because next time you'll know and you'll have moved on, right? If somebody is mocking you for your questions or opinions, again, the moderator should have stepped in long ago. Right? Everything has its price. Once you know how to run meetings well, being in badly run meetings will be painful. Similarly, once I actually sat down and learned more about teaching and learning, most online courses became excruciating because they were badly done. And I'm not sure if you folks are aware of just how well run the MDS courses are from a pedagogical point of view. I'm not qualified to comment on the data science, but from a teaching point of view, they're outstanding. And you should all be grateful. So I learned a lot of this from my father, who was a vice president of the BC Teachers Federation in the mid-1970s. And he ran a good meeting. So that's what I've got. Things I would like you to discuss once you break out into your teams. Who gets a vote in your group? Presumably all of your team members have equal vote. Can Tiffany or Thomas or somebody else overrule you? Do they get a vote? Are they a tiebreaker if you're stuck? Right? These things seem unlikely until they actually happen, right? And once they actually happen, nobody can be impartial about deciding on a process. For open source projects, one of the hardest questions is, how do new people earn a vote? How do you get to the point where you get to have a say in the future of this medium-sized open source project? The Python Software Foundation has pretty firm rules, but it's a pretty big organization. A lot of others, it's if the founder of the project decides that you're ready, you're ready. Okay, that gets you your first half dozen. What do you do after that? How do people lose their votes? If somebody hasn't been seen for a year, did they lose their vote? If somebody's been a jerk, did they lose their vote? Who decides? How can you find out what's been decided? If you're the new person on the project, or if you've been pulled off on family things for 3 months and you're coming back, where do you look to find out what's been decided and what's been moved forward? A bunch of markdown files in a GitHub repo, one per meeting, is a godsend. And how do non-voters raise issues? If I'm not part of the project, how do I flag something as worthy of discussion? Do I just reach out to somebody who's a core member? What do I do? Right? Again, 4 people working on a project for 10 weeks. I think the MDS projects are 12 weeks. You probably don't need to decide all of this, but if you're expecting that your project is going to continue, if you're expecting to build a piece of software that might then turn into an R package that people keep using, if it's successful at all, you're going to make decisions about these things. You just might not realize that you're making those decisions. I think explicit is better than implicit. And in a better world than this, in the root directory of every project on GitHub, along with a license file and a README file, there would be a governance file saying, here's how we make decisions. So that's everything I had to say. Now I get to figure out how to stop screen sharing